Thank you for being with us here today. I'm Vicki Clark, President of the Cape May County Chamber of Commerce, and appreciate you joining us here for our webinar today. I'm going to turn the program this afternoon over to Steve Morey, who is with Mott McDonald and is chairman of the Chamber Environment and Legislative Committee. Steve's going to tell us about our program and introduce our speaker. So without anything else, Steve, the program is yours.
Here we go. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for everybody who's attending and has taken interest in this topic. We're going to be talking about New Jersey's new program agenda to protect against climate threats. This is a result of Governor Murphy's Executive Order 100 to challenge the state to address future climate threats and present climate threats. And this afternoon, we have the pleasure of introducing Vincent Mazzei. He's the Assistant Commissioner for Watershed and Land Management. He oversees the new Division of Land Resource Protection and the new Division of Watershed Protection and Restoration. Vince was just selected to lead the WLM program in June. He was previously supervised the Bureau of Inland Regulation and the Division of Land Use Regulation. Vince began his DEP career in 1988 following his graduation from Stevens Institute of Technology, and is a licensed professional engineer and is regarded as an expert in flood risk analysis and mitigation. For more than 30 years, Vince has worked to support environmentally responsible planning and design and construction of thousands of development infrastructure projects through New Jersey. Vince authored New Jersey's Flood Hazard Control Act rules, which are the most stringent statewide flood hazard area and stream corridor protection regulations in the nation. That's what he said. I didn't say that. He has a leading role in the development of NJPACT, which is the New Jersey Protecting Against Climate Threats, a targeted regulatory reform initiative aimed at modernizing many of the state's environmental regulations to protect against climate threats. He also serves as chairman of the New Jersey Association for Floodplain Management. A little bit more about Vince, if you don't know, was named the 2018 Government Engineer of the Year by the American Society of Civil Engineers, North Jersey branch, and in 2016, he was Civil Engineer of the Year by the American Society of Civil Engineers Central Jersey branch. He is a two-time recipient of the State of New Jersey Teamwork and Partnership Award. Vince lives in Hunterdon County with his wife and fellow DEP employee Becky and their three children, Zachary, Evelyn, and Jonah. And Vince, I'm very, very happy to introduce you today, and the program is yours.
Wow, thank you. That was a wonderful introduction. I'm overwhelmed. I'm gonna have to ask you to come with me every time I walk into a room so you can introduce me now. So I'm very thankful that you've invited me today to speak about this topic. It's an important topic, and we want the same thing ultimately, right? We want people to be safe. We want economic growth to be responsible and to not be inhibited where it shouldn't be. And this is a difficult challenge that we're facing, right? You know, we have science that suggests some pretty scary things on our horizon, and how best do we adapt our regulations to that? One of the challenges that, you know, we see, you know, for example, the house that I live in is about 70 years old. You know, it hopefully will be around for, you know, another few decades or so or longer. So the things that we build today are going to be inherited by our children and our grandchildren. And so the decisions that we make today will affect people for generations to come. So it's trying to find that balance, right, between what the science says and what the needs are of today versus the needs of tomorrow. That's difficult. So these conversations are hugely important to us. The last thing that we want to do at the state is to adopt a set of rules or propose a set of rules that are so onerous that no one can meet them, or miss the mark and aren't protective enough where they should be. So I'm going to give you, I don't want to say a high level view of where we are. I'm going to drill down in a couple important places. And I certainly am looking forward to a robust conversation. At the end of this, at the end of the presentation, there's an email address. If you think of something after this presentation that you wanted to ask me, if you're like me, about 5 minutes after something ends, I'm like, oh, I should have asked them about this, that, or the other thing. So you'll have your opportunity. You can reach out to us. And I am going to share the PowerPoint with you folks so that you can look at it later, because some of the slides have information on it that, I'm not going to read every line, but it's more just to explain to you, where we're coming. So I trust that you can all see the slideshow, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. Thank you. All right. So just a couple minor things kind of before we launch into the regulatory standards that we're contemplating at this point. One of the reasons why we've tried to, as part of this NJPACT initiative, is we've tried to align the rules so that we can take a more watershed-based approach to what we do. I think the state's regulations do a very good job at looking at individual site impacts and making sure that what's happening in that site doesn't adversely impact things on that site, or that it's elevated properly or whatnot. But it doesn't take a step back and look at holistically what is happening in the overall watersheds or in our bays. So our plan going forward in the next few years is to try to take our rules and turn them in that direction so that they're based more on a holistic approach of like what people are doing on the ground and how that impacts the overall community and vice versa, right? And so these NJPACT rulemaking efforts that we've undertaken is the first step in that, right? Just a couple of things to just remind you too. We used to be called Land Use Management. Now we're the Watershed and Land Management Program. The Division of Land Use Regulation, which is where wetlands, coastal program, CAFRA waterfront development, and flood hazard area, that's now called the Division of Land Resource Protection. And then there's a new division called the Division of Watershed Protection and Restoration. And so those two divisions are in the Watershed and Land Management Program that I'm the AC of. Now, I think you probably all are aware of some of the history of this, but Executive Order 89 was the first thing that Governor Murphy signed in this regard to kind of set some goals for the state, and Executive Order 100, which was implemented by Commissioner McCabe's Administrative Order 2020-01, basically set the DEP on a course to update and kind of consolidate into one rulemaking package some targeted and also very broad changes to the flood hazard rules, the coastal zone management rules, the freshwater wetlands rules, and also the stormwater rules. I'm not going to be talking too much about stormwater today, but that is an important component to this. We've gone through a robust stakeholdering process where we've had upwards of 250 people or so at a time, and the conversation is hard. It took about 4 hours to get through. We had to do two 2-hour sessions to get through the PowerPoints that we had with all the details in it. So those can be available to you if you'd like it, but so this is more of a targeted approach today. So, I don't think we need to spend too much time on the different impacts of climate change that we're aware of. The scientific report from DEP on climate change is consistent on not just talking about the environmental impacts, but the economic impacts of climate change, right? The environmental impacts are pretty obvious today, but the long-term economic loss that would occur if we don't plan correctly is something that we have in mind as we're developing these rules. So it's our belief that by having responsible development today, that we'll end up saving money in the long run, right? A good example is someone's home. If it's elevated properly, if the higher you go, the lower your flood insurance is going to be, right? The higher the lowest floor is. And roughly speaking, depending on the size of the house and the amount of insurance and whatnot, for every foot up you go, it of course adds a certain amount of cost to the building, but you make that money up in savings of flood insurance within about 6 years on average, 4 to 6 years. And so for the lifetime of the structure, you have lower flood insurance rates and it's more resilient. So that's the kind of thing that we're focusing on as far as a reduction in long-term economic impacts. I don't have to convince you that New Jersey has some flooding problems. About a third of the state lies in a flood hazard area, if not more. FEMA estimated about 35%. And we're ranked third in the nation as to NFIP claims since 1978. And so saving people's lives is not an insignificant thing, right? And there are secondary and tertiary impacts from flooding too, along the coast. In Hurricane Sandy, there were 37 people that lost their lives in New Jersey. But I read a report, I think from FEMA, that estimated that along the eastern seaboard that between 200 and 400 people died post Hurricane Sandy due to carbon monoxide poisoning because they had generators running and they didn't properly manage their generators. So the long-term economic and social impacts of that kind of event are still being felt today, right? So what's our objective? We intend to address the unavoidable impacts of climate change, such as sea level rise, and all the things that go through it, that go along with that, through what we're calling targeted regulatory reforms that will modernize our rules and increase on resiliency, focus on increased resiliency throughout the state. And I think it's always important to remember what our principles are as we do this, right? So whenever we're contemplating a rule change, when my team meets and we talk through how to fit in a proposal to do something or another, we always measure it against these 6 guiding principles, right? We intend to develop regulatory standards that are commensurate with the anticipated level of risk. So the more at risk you are, the more protective the standards should be. The less risk you are, if you're on the edges of the floodplain, then the standards don't need to be as protective. We want to do what we can to provide tools to people that are making decisions today so they can make informed decisions. Like I mentioned before, the things that are being built today are going to be around for a very long time. And so we want to ensure that the homes and the bridges and the roads and the buildings and the businesses that'll be here 50, 75, 100 years from now are as safe as they can be based on the science that we have. Obviously, our main goal is to protect public health and safety in consideration of climate threats, both today and tomorrow. We want to ensure that whatever we do is based on the current science that considers future conditions as informed by that science. We want to encourage development and redevelopment that's safe, sustainable, resilient, and that wherever possible reduces risks from and contribution to climate change. And we want to facilitate the creation and restoration of natural systems that will assist in the mitigation of climate threats. So we're going to talk about that as well today, different incentives that we have for things like living shorelines and whatnot. So the rulemaking effort that we're currently working to write and develop and internally vetting, it plays out in 8 basic themes, right? Better protection against future inundation and flood damage, protecting critical facilities and infrastructure like hospitals and evacuation routes and pipelines and things like that. Increased protection of land and water resources. So this speaks to, can we do a better job under the wetlands, flood hazard, and coastal rules at, targeted site-specific impacts. Stormwater management obviously is a part of it. I have a slide or 2 on that, but there's more to come on the stormwater front. How planning should occur under the coastal rules, nature-based solutions like living shorelines, renewable energy and green building design. So renewable energy speaks to things like not only just solar panels and offshore wind, but there's other things that people are doing, even things like having charging stations for electric vehicles, things like that. And then process improvements, because we want to better coordinate what we're doing on a state level with the local level and with FEMA. So we'll speak about that a bit. So now here's where the rubber hits the road, right? So how does this look, right, for inundation and flood damage? How do we tackle that in the state? And there's three main ways where this is being focused. One is establishing an area known as the inundation risk zone to account for land that we anticipate will be inundated by sea level rise at some point in the future. And I'm going to show you some drawings that depict these things and kind of explain it in more detail. The second thing is that as sea levels rise, then the tidal flood elevation will also rise, right? So if sea level goes up 2 or 3 feet, then we can expect at least 2 or 3 feet in a rise in the flood elevation. And flood maps, as good as they are, they look backwards at past events, right? They look at the science that we've had and the past events that we've had. And so that's a snapshot in time of where if a flood were to happen today, what it might look like, but it doesn't speak to future conditions. And the same dynamic is happening in our riverine systems, not so much in Cape May County, but in other parts of the state, our riverine systems, not because of sea level rise, but because of more precipitation that will occur. A warmer atmosphere can hold more water, and more water in the atmosphere means more intense rainfall and more intense precipitation. So that means more riverine flooding as well. Now, this is a table that has been, that I kind of borrowed from the Rutgers University Science and Technical Advisory Panel. It's called the STAP report. And there, as you can see here, there are, and this is a publicly available document, and if you're interested in it, we can get a copy to you. But you can see that at the top, there's different dates, and there are different emission levels for 2070, 2100, and 2150. And then there's different chances that sea level rise will exceed certain amounts, right? So, you know, the first target is, well, which year are we going to shoot for? And so the first decision we made was to plan for a year 2100 condition, because our opinion is that buildings and roads and bridges and infrastructure is likely to be there, if not in 2100, pretty close to 2100. So that was a reasonable target for us to focus on. Now, the second thing was, well, what percent chance? And we initially started out by saying, well, let's take a 50% chance. There's a 50% chance that sea level rise will be at least 3.3 feet, right? So we thought, okay, that's a good place to start. But upon further investigation of the science, we realized that what we were really saying here is that there's a 50% chance that it could be more than 3.3 feet. And so here we would be asking people or requiring people to elevate their buildings, new homes going in, and we're saying you have to be 3.3 feet higher than you otherwise would have to be. And there's only 50% chance that's going to be enough. So the number that we've been focusing on for the purposes of our rulemaking has been 5.1 feet. We'll say 5 feet. And that's the 17% chance exceedance. So what this is saying is that there's only a 17% chance that sea level rise will exceed 5.1 feet. And so we feel that that's a more appropriate target for public infrastructure and for buildings and things that people are relying on for their safe conduct and for their businesses. So the way this looks, this is kind of a cross section here. You can see the current sea level, current shoreline, right? This person's walking away from the water. And this is the future sea level, right? This is the future shoreline. So the first piece of this is that inundation risk zone. So that's the land between today's shoreline and tomorrow's shoreline based on that 5 foot rise. And similarly, the floodplain does the same thing. Here's the 100-year floodplain limit, and here's the future floodplain limit. So this home, so if I kind of switch it to a plan view, and you can see at top there, so you see there's 4 zones here, right? That home is not in the floodplain today, but at some point, it's likely to be in the floodplain. And that person won't know that because the flood maps don't show that. And so they're not going to have flood insurance, right? Because only if you have a mortgage are you required to have flood insurance. So really what this means is that there are 4 different zones that we would have standards for, right? There's zone 1 is the area that's underwater today. Zone 2 is the land that would be inundated either twice daily because of high tides or permanently. Zone 3 is the existing floodplain limits, and zone 4 is the future floodplain limits. So having standards that are commensurate with the risk level in each of these zones is important. So let's look at the inundation risk zone. And you can see there's a drawing of New Jersey that estimates what land lies within 5 feet in elevation of the mean high or high water line. Because that's what we're really saying. We're saying that the mean high or high water line is where the inundation stops today. And if we add 5 feet to it, you can see what that does to the coastline. And I'm sure you're all looking at Cape May, and you can see that there's a large portion of blue there. That's not insignificant. Now, we're not saying that things can't be built in this area. We're not saying that that public infrastructure can't be supported, or that that we're going to prohibit certain types of things in here. What it does mean, though, is that we want to take a very close look at what happens here and make sure that we're doing everything the state and whoever's proposing it, do as much as we can to make it as safe as possible. Our plan is to provide a map that people can look at. Rutgers has a great tool right now at njfloodmapper.org. I'm going to show you a couple of screenshots of Atlantic City that kind of show you what that looks like. But you can play around with that and you can see your inundation levels. You can say, well, okay, well, if I have 1 foot of sea level rise, what does that look like in my community? 2 feet, 3 feet. But what we'll do is we'll provide a snapshot of what the 5-foot elevation looks like. But then we'll always give people an opportunity to give us more site-specific topography to show us that they're out of the inundation risk zone if they're mapped within it. So here's an aerial view of Atlantic City from NJ Flood Mapper, and I encourage you all to go if you haven't played around with it. It's kind of scary, right? Because this is what it looks like with 5 feet of sea level rise. So everything that's blue and green would be underwater at least twice a day, right? So the green represents low-lying areas where water gets trapped and probably can't get out. So maybe due to precipitation or storm sewers that are backing up. And the darker the blue, the deeper it is. So you can see like the whitish areas, maybe only a foot or so. But this is not an insignificant part of the community, right? I'm not sure that the evacuation routes would work. They're shown as white, so I'm not sure if they're above it or not. Portions of it look like they're out, but not completely. So, you know, this is the kind of thing that we want to be mindful of, is that if someone were to build, you know, to make improvements to an evacuation route, or put a new bridge in, or put in some, you know, public infrastructure, they're mindful of trying to elevate to the extent we can. We know we're not going to be able to raise every road in the state 5 feet. We know that that's not possible. We're not even going to try to do that. But when decisions are made, and even 6 inches or a foot raising an intersection might make a big difference from nuisance flooding and extend the life of that before sea level rise subsumes it. So the second piece is what happens to the tidal flood hazard area. This is a screenshot of Seaside Park, and it shows, you know, I'm sure you're all aware of it. The V zone is the pink, the blue is the A zone, right? So the V zone is where there's at least 3 feet of wave action on top of the still water. The line with the triangles is called the LIMWA, the limit of moderate wave action, and that's where past between that and the V zone, you have between 1.5 and 3 feet of wave action. So there's different construction standards that apply to those areas because it's more dangerous to build a building, and there's different forces. So what we're saying here is that, well, if sea level rise is going to go up 5 feet, then we have to assume that floodplains are going to go up by at least 5 feet. Now, if you're in zone AE here and it's elevation 7, that means that this climate adjusted flood elevation would be 12. Now, we're not saying that the roads have to be elevated to 12 or that every building can be elevated to 12, but homes could be. And it's interesting because one of the pushbacks that we always get, obviously, is that, you know, let's say a home is damaged and somebody rebuilds it and they're required to elevate it now, because all of these things look prospectively, right? We're not saying that anything existing has to be modified, but if someone were proposing modifications to a building or a road, or you know, a substantially damaged building and it's being rebuilt, it would have to be built to today's code, right? Electrical, fire, everything else. And so the flood code is part of that. And this is sort of anecdotally, but I remember years ago when I was working on a project along the Delaware River up in Warren County, where I did a lot of work back in the day. And this person's home had burned down and he wanted to rebuild it. And we made him elevate it because the flood elevation was like 10 feet off the ground at that point. And he was not happy that every other house in his neighborhood was at street level and that his house was 10 feet in the air. And I can understand that. I wouldn't have wanted that too. And a few years later, there was actually a flood along the Delaware, and there was a picture of his house in the paper, which I have somewhere. I'm gonna have to incorporate it into my slideshows. He was the only house that didn't get flooded in the entire community. And he actually said, you know, I was really, he cursed in the, it was bleeped out, but he said, I was really not happy with DEP, I'll put it that way, that they made me elevate it, but I was the only one that didn't get flood damage. So that's kind of where we're trying to come from with this. Now in fluvial and riverine systems, the same type of dynamic is going to happen, but because of increased precipitation. And I won't spend too much time talking about this because we have a lot of other things to focus on. But what we're seeing is that precipitation could increase as much as 35% by 2100, and that today's 500-year flood is about 38% more water. And so today's 500-year flood on FEMA maps might be a good approximation for tomorrow's 100-year flood. And if any of you do work in riverine communities, I can be happy to talk to you more about that. Now, one of the things that we also want to ensure, and this is something that we've noticed as a disconnect between us and local communities, is the National Flood Insurance Program and how that's administered in the state. So as you know, communities, it's a voluntary program, and communities voluntarily agree to meet minimum NFIP standards, and then people in the town are eligible for flood insurance through the FEMA, and there's assistance, there's incentives to have higher standards so that people can get rate reductions and whatnot. FEMA recently told us that work within a special flood hazard area under the NFIP, if it's not started within 180 days, that it expires. Now, our permits at the state are good for 5 years or longer. And so we weren't interested in having them expire, but what we decided to do was to pursue pausing the permit. So we would create a free online service where people could go on and register that they've started to work on their permit. And if they don't register within 180 days after issuance, the permit would be paused. Okay, it would be kind of automatically suspended, let's say. And then once we hear from them, it can be reinstated, and then the 180 days can start from that point. So once work starts, you're fine. But the thinking here is that we could issue a permit for something, and then the flood maps could change or the science could change. And if work hasn't commenced yet, there could be an opportunity to upgrade it so that it meets the current standards. So this is something that FEMA has asked us to do. And there are some other places too where sometimes we'll issue a permit that doesn't meet, on state level, that doesn't meet minimum NFIP standards because there's a demonstration that's made to us at the state level that it's okay. And then it puts the local floodplain administrator in a difficult position, or the local construction official in a difficult position, because the state has issued this flood permit or a coastal permit that says that it's okay. And so most people presume that that means it must meet minimum NFIP standards, and that's not universally the case. So we're doing what we can to align our standards with that, so that it helps everyone across the board. There are a number of places where we intend to increase our protection of our land and water resources. In our CZM rules, so our CAFR regulations, these are some things that we intend to do. Clarify the presence of engineering dunes does not diminish the importance of other dune areas. These are kind of clarifications. There's a standard, a special area called the erosion hazard rule. So we would replace that with the inundation risk zone. So that would be the same in both the flood hazard rules and the coastal rules. As standards for pre-storm activities on beaches and dunes, where certain type of work is being proposed, and this is similar to an existing standard, but it's being broadened, that traffic level D, which is a measurement of the ability of traffic movements to occur, that it's not diminished below that. And more importantly, and this is something that will be kind of across the board, no matter what kind of permit, is asking people to contemplate the impacts of climate change on the viability of their projects. And so based on the size of the project, the number of people that are going to rely on it, and the potential loss that could happen, both economically and to society, if that structure is inaccessible or lost, is important. So for example, a hospital, somebody's building a new hospital. We want to make sure people can get to the hospital. We want to make sure that the hospital is not built, on an island in the floodplain that no one can get to during the flood. Now, maybe there's no place that it can go other than in the flood zone, but maybe there are places where it can be at less risk than others. There could be places in a community where flood elevations will be 1 foot instead of 3 feet or 5 feet or 8 feet. And so it's having that conversation during the design phase of a project so that we can be part of that, so that we can help everybody make informed decisions. Lots of detail on the next few slides. I'm just going to give you some highlights, but you can go back to it and read it. And if you have any questions, you can ask me. Expanding under the flood hazard rules. So the flood hazard rules are incorporated into the coastal rules. So if you get a waterfront development permit or a CAFA permit, then we perform a review under the flood hazard rules as part of that permit if you're in the floodplain, which most of Cape May County is in. So most of these standards would apply. A lot of these things are based on riverine systems, right? So if the stream drains less than a certain amount, we're beefing up our standards. Placing riparian zones on non-ocean front sides of barrier islands. So right now, barrier islands along the coast don't have riparian zones, which is like a setback from the water that we look at. We look at to protect vegetation, and we look at ensuring that development happens in there responsibly. And what's interesting is that the mainland side, the way it's written in the rules, the mainland side of the bays have a riparian zone, but the barrier island side doesn't. And we're not talking about the ocean front, because the ocean front has dunes and beaches and whatnot, and there's different standards that apply there. But we want to have equal water quality protections across the state. So that's part of the proposal. There's a disconnect between the way we do endangered species protection under wetlands versus flood hazards. So we would be aligning that. We would be aligning some of our mitigation requirements for riparian zone impacts. And so on. So don't, obviously if there's something that's interesting to you on these slides, we can talk about it, but I want to make sure that I give everybody the benefit of seeing what we're doing. Freshwater wetlands, there's a number of things here. Clarifying wetlands impacts have to be necessary for the project. Stormwater management, there was a disconnect in the way that we did it with wetlands as compared to flood hazard and coastal. One of the things on the last slide and on this side here is for horizontal directional drilling. So we've decided that under the existing rules, they're basically exempt from activities if you directionally drill under a resource. But we've recognized that there are some risks associated with that. And so we decided to start regulating those, and we're working on standards. The Science Advisory Board is looking into it and will recommend standards to us. But at this point, we're intending to adopt the requirements that you need a permit if you're going to directional drill. More comprehensive mitigation requirements, restoration within 25 feet of a wetlands if there's a redevelopment project, different changes to transition areas. I'm not sure how often this comes up in your communities, but these are important changes. This one is an important change for the stormwater management rules. Now, right now, we're in the works. We have a rule package that would include what we're calling on-site retention of the water quality storm to reduce off-site pollution and flooding impacts. The water quality storm is 1.25 inches of rain. And so what this is saying is that if you're contemplating development that triggers the stormwater management rules, which is that major development threshold, that's a 1/4 acre of impervious surface or 1 acre of disturbance, then you'd have to capture, and to the extent that you can infiltrate the water quality storm, that 1.25 inches of rain, that first flush or first runoff that you get, which has the most pollutants. That's not always going to be possible, so you have to detain it in the cases like that. But this would increase the number of BMPs that you would need generally on a project. Another thing that we're contemplating is right now, if you're reconstructing pavement and you're not actually increasing the amount of impervious surface, then there's no requirement to do anything to treat the runoff from that. Now that's interesting because what that's doing is decisions that were made 50, 75, 100 years ago that have impaired water quality because there's no treatment of runoff, that's allowed to persist under the existing rules. So we feel that certain reconstruction activities, it's an opportunity to provide better water quality treatment. And so we plan to propose to adopt the same standards for reconstruction as we would for new construction. The last point is just about the wetlands rules that I covered before. So this is something that would be important to the folks, I'm sure, on the call. Adding standards to the CZM rules, the coastal zone management rules, so CAFRA, regarding the minimum criteria for determining consistency with the state plan change, approved center, approved core, center, or node, with the purposes of the rules and the requirements in CAFRA. So this is basically trying to align this, what we do in CAFRA with the state plan. Deleting the department delineated coastal centers from the CZM rules, that's in Appendix H. And centers that want to be designated would have to go through the state plan endorsement process. Nature-based solutions, there are several slides that deal with this, but I'm going to go through this kind of quickly because I want to make sure you have time to ask questions. But basically the idea is that we know from the available science and just from our experience at the state that shorelines that are protected using vegetation in concert with other things like rock and wood tend to last longer and be more resilient than bulkheaded areas, right? Bulkheads can be undermined, they can collapse, there could be catastrophic failure. They can't adapt to the changing climate the same way that a nature-based solution could be. So we're doing a few things with regard to this. One is that we're providing incentives for these nature-based solutions so that if someone were to stabilize a stream bank or an ocean bank or a bay, that we would want them to go to there first. Now, we recognize that not every case is going to be able to support that. You might not have the room to do nature-based solutions, or you might have so much erosion there that it's not sustainable and you need to have hard armoring. So that's fine. But basically it's lining up the rules so that it incentivizes the use of living shorelines and not only encourages it, but requires that that's the starting point. And you'll see that a lot in our regulations where we set the bar high and we say, well, this is where we'd like you to be, but then there's off ramps where you can't achieve compliance with that because we recognize that not everything, no two projects are the same, right? And no two applicant scenarios are the same. Again, modifying the living shoreline rules to remove limitations on placement of fill, address ecological risk. Again, we'll come back to this if you want to talk more about it. Renewable energy. So this is difficult because we want to promote renewable energy, but we want to do it in a way that is environmentally responsible, right? So trying to strike a balance between maintaining habitat, like shellfish habitat, while encouraging renewable energy. So a lot of these offshore wind projects are miles off the coast outside of New Jersey waters, but the transmission lines have to come through to the mainland. And that means placing large transmission cables sometimes through shellfish habitat and whatnot. So the rules don't really speak to this. The rules today talk about communication cables, not really electric cables. And so there's no depth requirement. There's no plan to kind of mitigate or offset or evaluate the shellfish habitat impacts that would occur for this because it's not something that we see today. So our rules would include standards that would balance that because we want to protect the shellfish habitat. We want to protect the commercial fishermen and what their interests are, but we also want to try to promote offshore wind to the extent that we can. So we'd have to modify the marine fish and fisheries rules to include a provision that finds that the installation of electric cables and associated things are acceptable, conditionally acceptable is the language that's often used in CAFRA, right? To say that this is fine as long as you make certain demonstrations, and increase our public notice requirements so that people that might be impacted by this would be aware of it. Solar is another thing too. There's not a lot that we've been contemplating with solar. We went down the road to see if we could maybe require certain size buildings to have solar on their roofs, but that proved to be economically unviable just because of the structural impact to the building. And also BPU has certain limits on how much energy a building can generate through solar panels. And the Uniform Construction Code says that we can't require certain types of things. So we're trying to work through some of the details of this. What we do want to do though is incentivize placing solar panels in areas where there's already disturbance. One of the things that I always point out to people is that if they're putting a parking lot in and they were to put a solar panel canopy over the parking lot, then that means the rainwater doesn't actually hit the the parking area and hits the solar panel. And that means it doesn't need it to be treated for water quality. And so not only are people happy because their car's not getting wet and they can walk out to their car during rain, the developer's also saving money because they don't have to have any kind of treatment for that water quality storm. So there are some incentives that we're trying to incorporate. And the last thing I wanted to cover was sort of some of our process improvements. We have a lot of today what's called permits by rule. The flood hazard rules have, between the flood hazard and the coastal rules, we have about 90 of them. And the way permits by rule work is that these are small activities that people can undertake, and there's no noticing to us, there's no application to the state, so we don't know that they're happening. So FEMA doesn't really like that because we're authorizing these things without even knowing about them, and there's no way to track it, so we don't know when they're being done. So if somebody's putting an addition on their house, or if there's minor road improvements or things like that, there's no ability for us to track it, to be able to monitor it, to look at it on a watershed basis, how much impacts are happening, what the impact level is in a given watershed. So what we're doing is contemplating creating an online system so that if somebody wanted to undertake one of these permits, we're going to call them permits by registration, because you have to register for them. So you go online, register, and say, name, address, lot, block. If it's a utility line or if it's a pipeline or a roadway, there'd be a drop-down box for that. And then identifying, okay, we're planning to do this activity and this activity and this activity. And it goes in the system, the person gets back, it's free. The person gets back a PDF letter that says, thanks for registering for these activities. It's in our system. And that way DEP enforcement can monitor it. And that way the person has it, can show it to their town construction official and say, okay, I registered for this activity. So we think that this will help across the board for us to be able to keep track of what's going on, and as well as be able to adapt our rules going forward. We also have something called permits by certification. So these are online permits that we currently have, where you go online, you make certain certifications, and then you instantly get a permit. And it's one step up from a permit by registration. There's a fee associated with the most of these, and some of them are never used. So we've decided to broaden the categories and turn them into general permits so that they're actually useful to people. One of the proposals is that, at least for things in the flood hazard area, that only a New Jersey licensed professional engineer or architect in certain cases can apply for them. Some of the certifications require specific engineering knowledge, and it's kind of an odd structure today in the sense that it'll say, let's say a homeowner is applying for one of these permits, it'll say, I certify that I have a certification from an engineer that says X, Y, and Z, or I certify that I'm not in a V zone or in a floodway or something. And these are not things that, the typical homeowner or a typical user really be able to do. So the requirement to have a licensed professional apply for it, we think will have lead to a higher level of submission to us and fewer problems going forward. The very, very first permit by certification that we ever issued, the person said they were not in the floodway, and we looked at it and they were in a floodway. So, it's been an ongoing struggle for us. And then for all permits, kind of tying into this 180-day thing, is having this registration system saying, okay, here's your permit, and can you notify us online for free? Just register and put in your file number and say, we plan to start construction on or around this date. Having notice of deed restrictions for private properties. So in some cases where developments happen in a flood hazard area, we would want the deed to have a notice on it saying the state has determined that this site is subject to flooding. And so that way people that buy the house or the building in the future, or rent from an apartment complex, they understand that there's risks associated with that. So there's an opportunity for the permittee to upload a copy of it, let us know that you're done building, right? And if, let's say we issue a permit, sometimes we issue permits and we don't hear from the person ever again. We don't know if it was built. We don't know if they were abandoned. We don't know if the person moved away. We don't know what happened. So having some kind of automatic response from our system saying, hey, you got a permit last year to build a pool or to add a lane onto, fix a turning lane on an intersection. Did you ever do it? That way we can inspect them and we can see what's happening on the ground a little bit more accurately. So I know I did a lot of information there, and I'll stick around as long as you'd like me to answer questions, but I'd like to open up to you to ask questions.
Thank you, Vince. That was a very, very overarching.
Overwhelming.
Well, that too.
Yeah.
Presentation. Steve, I know that you had some questions, and we have a few in the chat. So if you want to start, we'll do that, and then we'll go to the chat. And if anyone wants to place questions in the chat, we can also use the raised hand feature. So I'll be monitoring the chat and the raised hands. But Steve, why don't you take it first?
Vince, I'll just start off with an economics question. What happens to the homeowner, the thousands of homeowners, when I look at the flood maps, that all of a sudden find themselves in a flood hazard area and they're in the middle of a 30-year mortgage? How does that work? Is the bank going to come back and say you're now required to get flood insurance?
Yeah, that's a good question. Flood insurance, so far in our experience, has been predicated on what the FEMA map, the flood insurance rate map, shows, right? So for example, in riverine systems in the state, we already regulate a flood plain that's bigger than FEMA's floodplain. And so those people that are outside FEMA's 100-year floodplain limit or base flood elevation aren't required to get flood insurance. For example, my mom has a place up in Maine that she inherited from her aunt, and it's right outside the floodplain limit on the map, but it's near the water. And I pleaded with my mother, please get flood insurance, because it only costs like $34 a month if you're outside the mapped flood area. So I can't speak to exactly what banks would do, but our experience so far with our expanded floodplain limits that we already have is that it's only affected by what the flood insurance rate map shows, and nothing that we do here is going to impact the flood insurance rate maps.
We'll take a question from the chat, which is about the 17%. Basically, a comment that it doesn't make sense to this person. Why not use the same logic, select 5% or 1%, worst case scenario?
So in other words, yeah, and that's a really good question, because the 100-year floodplain is really called the 1% flood, right? So that means that in any given year, there's a 1% chance of that flood happening. And so that table was suggesting that that there's a 17% chance, or I guess, or you could say there's an 83% chance that sea level rise could be up to 5.1 feet. So why not go the further step, right, to go even higher? And that's kind of the balance that we're trying to achieve, is that we could go, I think the next number on the slide, the 95% limit was like 6.9 feet or something to that extent. We just felt that there was a balance that we had to achieve, and we felt that 5 feet was as far as we really could reasonably go at this point. People get pretty upset when we talk about 5 feet, and I don't know what they would say if it was 7 feet or 10 feet. So not a great answer, but that's kind of that balance that we're trying to reach there.
Okay. The next question in the chat is, so as a complementary review, is the NJDEP looking at how to make resiliency or elevation projects easier within these low-lying areas? Current wetland flood hazard CAFRA permitting requirements make these improvements difficult, i.e. costly, to permit and complete, especially in the dual jurisdictional areas with UASAE.
Oh, Army Corps.
So yeah, okay, thank you.
So can you read the first part of that question again? I think I missed a nuance there.
Sure.
I'm sorry.
So as a complementary review, is the NJDEP looking at how to make resiliency and elevation projects easier within these low-lying areas?
Yes, absolutely. Here's a good example. There's a road, let's say that has wetlands on both sides of it, public road, and the municipality or the county wants to elevate that road. They want to put drainage in, they want to elevate it a foot or two or 3 feet or whatever. because it's getting inundated. Now, well, that means if the road is higher, that means the side slopes go out further. That means more wetlands impacts, right? So we can't on one hand say don't have any wetlands impacts, but on the other hand say, but we want you to elevate your roads as high as you can. So there is that balance that we're trying to achieve here. And you know, public safety is always going to win the day. When I put my PE hat on, public safety is going to have to drive it. So yeah, so we're trying to find ways that we can facilitate communities to do what they want to do and to do the right thing, and to try to make sure that it's not onerous. Like, sure, elevate it all you want, but you have to pay $10 million in mitigation costs. That's not helpful.
The next question in the chat is, you speak of many changes and realignments. Is there a general schedule tied to these actions?
So that's a really great question. So we're still in the phase where we're writing the standards, developing them. And that's why conversations like this are important, because, we want to hear back from communities what they feel works and what doesn't work. So it needs to go through a legal review. And so that usually takes a couple months or so. So I'm anticipating that sometime in, late spring, right? Sometime in the spring that we would be proposing this rulemaking, maybe April. And then what happens after that is that there's a 60-day comment period where people then can review the rules, write in their comments, and then we have to respond to every single comment. So it usually takes upwards of about a year from proposal to have a rule adopted. So I would say that there's low likelihood that this would be adopted before the end of this year. So as far as the timing goes, so projects that are being contemplated today won't have to deal with the standard probably until next year.
The next question is, isn't the inundation risk zone is essentially a no-build zone because you would need a hardship waiver to build anything which is hard to get? How does that impact Cape May? Yeah,
no, that's a good question. We actually started off with that thinking that we would prohibit it. We initially contemplated saying, this area is so dangerous that we can't allow development to happen in this area without a hardship. And then when we really looked at it, we realized the amount of land that we were talking about and the fact that it would constitute a takings, right? A regulatory takings in a lot of cases. If we said to somebody, your property is now encumbered by this provision and you can't build anything, then the person can say, okay, state, thank you. Please buy the property from me. And so we don't obviously have the funds to be able to do that. So where we are today is to not require a hardship exception, but to require that anything that's built in there is built as safely as possible, and that there be a long-term plan. Like, in other words, if I'm building a road and in an area that's going to be underwater in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, what's the plan? Is the plan to keep elevating the road? Is the plan to remove the road after 40 years when it's underwater? Those are the kind of conversations that we're having right now. But yeah, at this point, we wouldn't be prohibiting things like that. We might prohibit expenditures of state funds in some certain areas, right? But even DOT wouldn't be too happy with us if we did that, because they have road improvements that have to happen. So.
Thank you. I want to remind everybody that if you'd like to use the raised hand feature and ask your question directly to Vince, we'll be happy to do that as well. Another question, a comment with a question. These changes are far-reaching. Isn't legislation required?
So the Flood Hazard Area, that's a good question. The Flood Hazard Area Control Act gives the state broad authority to regulate activities and protect the people in the state from flooding. And it doesn't limit us to, just a 100-year flood or a particular, scenario. So once flood risks are known, in this case, because of sea level rise, we feel that it's actually our mandated responsibility to adopt standards that are commensurate with the risk. So our read of our statutory authority is that we don't need legislative change to make these impacts.
Here's another one in the chat. It would be interesting to see the boardwalk on the Atlantic City side. Did not Stockton build a new building on or near that area?
That's a good question. I'm not sure what Stockton recently built, but that's the problem, is that it's probably in an area today that's fine, but will it be underwater in 20, 50, 30 years? I don't know. Yeah.
Steve, do you have anything else?
Yeah, Vince, I have one question. This goes back to the science, and there's some sense to using the 2050 projections, since they're a steady rate of sea level rise without the unknown of after 2060. Those projections are based on a lot of policy that may or may not come into play, change in global temperature and the effects on Antarctica collapsing into the ocean and things like that. They're all over the board. And 2050 is a 30-year projection that most planners and public agencies use as a standard planning tool when they're looking at their future projects and master plans and things like that. And also the staff does recommend that sea level rise be revisited periodically, preferably after releases of updated scientific reports from the IPCC. So why couldn't the DEP take and I understand, we're trying to protect, I know you said before an 80-year build, I guess a project or structure would last 80 years, but I think that there's a lot more structures that are in need of repair. A bulkhead doesn't last 80 years. It's a 30-year bulkhead. Why not use the shorter time period, at least to get this started and get people acclimated to it?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question. And actually, I'm gonna zoom back to that slide that shows that chart, because we can talk about that a little bit. So one of the problems, I'll do that. So yeah, you're right. We had these conversations internally, and to your point, you can see on this chart that for 2030 and 2050, there's no low, moderate, or high emission level projections, right? The thinking, the science supports that sort of irrespective of our emission levels, that this is what we're going to see in 2030 and 2050, right? And so there's a few things. One is that we thought about maybe doing 2070, 50-year horizon, or 2050, a 30-year horizon. But there are projects that would last much longer than that. And so the way that we've decided to tackle it, we felt that it wouldn't be responsible for us having this science and not having standards that were reflective of it for the lifetime of that structure. But there's also a recognition in the way that we're crafting this for those structures that won't have a lifespan of that long. So for example, solar panels, 25 or 30 years, I think a solar panel installer once told me that every year that a solar panel loses about 1% of its efficiency because of just wear. So after 25, 30 years, they're probably not going to be viable and they're going to be pulled out anyway. So maybe it's not so bad to have solar panels in an area that in 2100 is going to be underwater, because by 2050 or 2070, it won't be. So embedded in the standards, again, we start high, but then we recognize that if an applicant can make a demonstration that the thing that they're doing is not even going to be there in 2100 or 2070, then there's some recognition of that.
We have a few more postings in the chat. We'll start with how do the proposed changes align with similar rules proposed rules issued by the Corps, like Army Corps of Engineers, I suppose.
Yeah, I haven't seen any. Yeah, the Army Corps of Engineers. They recently proposed to readopt their nationwide permits. Usually it's like on a 5-year cycle. They did them a little early this time, I think. The last time was 2017. I don't recall seeing anything that was specific to sea level rise in there. So I'm not really sure what the federal government is proposing. The new administration that just came in has some interest in addressing this issue. One of the things was President Obama had in 2015 signed an executive order saying that federal facilities had to meet certain flood standards that incorporated climate change. And then that had been taken away under President Trump, but then President Biden has just recently put that back into place. So we're not really sure what the federal government is proposing to do at this point, but I would not be surprised if we don't see something soon.
What has the historical documented or measured sea level rise over the past 50 years, and how does that compare with the projected rate at 100 years?
So South Jersey has two things going against it with regards to sea level rise. One is the fact that sea levels have been rising relatively linearly. And then also there's subsidence in the ground because of groundwater extraction. And also my geologist wife, who's smarter than me, could explain this better than I, but North Jersey was under the ice under glaciers during the Ice Age, right? And so that pushed down the land in North Jersey and kind of raised the ground a bit in South Jersey. Ice is gone and South Jersey is slowly subsiding. So we have that dynamic of the ground sinking slowly and the water rising. I think it's measured at Atlantic City at about 4 millimeters a year. And it's been, I saw a graph from 1913 to 2000 that, or maybe 2000, maybe like 1990s, that it was relatively linear. But what seems to be happening is that it's accelerating because of emissions and the warming of the atmosphere. And so we have seen it. The staff report, actually, if you'll notice that these numbers here, you'll see that it says that from 2001 to 2019, that there was 0.2 foot observed rise. So an average, by 2010. So there already has been, it has been seen happening and it's accelerating.
The next question is, what time horizon do other coastal states use? Are they using 80 years less than 20% chance of occurring?
For sea level rise, I don't know that anyone has gone as robust as we have along the East Coast. Some states have talked about incorporating more freeboard. So, taking the base flood elevation and adding a certain amount to it. So I'm not aware of anybody that's gone more than what we're proposing or is talking about doing more than we're proposing.
Okay, and I think this is the last question or comment in the chat, and then I'll turn it back to Steve for some closing questions or comments. I anticipate the parkway underwater in less than 10 years under certain conditions.
Is that a question? Do we anticipate that it'll be underwater within 10 years?
Question or comment?
I'm not honestly sure. I know, portions of it are even today, right? There's like sunny day flooding that happens along parts of it because of stormwater backing up during high tides. So that wouldn't surprise me, but I really don't know. I'd have to look at the elevations of the parkway. But honestly, what a good way to look at that would be is if you go to that NJFloodMapper.org. Let me pull it back up so you can see it. So you can write it down if you want to. Sea levels coming up. There, NJFloodMapper.org. You could put in a 1 foot rise or a 2 foot rise or a 3 foot rise, and you could correlate that to that table there. So you could see like, all right, well, they're saying there's a 50% chance by 2050 that it's going to be this much. Let's see what Cape May would look like if it was 2 feet or 3 feet or whatever. So you can see how vulnerable portions of the community is by that.
Thank you, Vince. I believe you mentioned when we were chatting before the program started that you would allow us to share your PowerPoint. And as I mentioned before, everyone will receive a copy of the recording. So they'll have the benefit of reviewing your comments as you went through the slides as well. So on behalf of the Chamber, I'd like to thank you, and I'll turn it back over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Vicky. Vince, thanks for coming down. This is a very complicated issue, and then you try to regulate that issue, and it just even makes it a little more even more complicated. And it's tough to digest. I read the Rutgers report last night, and I enjoyed it, but I can't say that it wasn't comprehensive and a little, I'm not saying confusing, but for the naked eye, it's a lot to absorb. But I wanted to see where your numbers were coming from. And again, it's a judgment call, but I know that the staff report was intended to help the DEP, regulate impacts from climate change. It's coming, but I know that these rules will have a fiscal impact to a lot of communities, governments, and individuals and businesses. So there is valid concerns for what we're going to see in the proposed rules. And I will say that you've been very fair. You've had at least 3 stakeholder meetings since last March, I guess now. Do you have another one planned before the rules will be proposed to give stakeholders an opportunity to weigh in after they do think about this for a little bit?
Yeah, we've actually done, if you count some of the internal ones that we've done, like with other state agencies, we've actually done, I think, 37 stakeholder meetings across the board. Yeah, so we're a little tired. I'm not sure if there's any more coming up on the books. I don't think there is. That doesn't mean that we couldn't have one though. So if there's interest, that's something that we certainly can talk about. And I think what we've tried to do is sort of transition to, instead of having like that, like the last one that I think that you were on, there was like almost 300 people on it. And so it becomes hard for people to ask questions and really kind of get into the weeds and stuff. So it seems like these more targeted, when groups like yours are interested in hearing from us, say, okay, well, let's have that conversation. So I think that's pretty much the stage we're at this point.
Okay, so as usual, the devil's in the details. So when we finally see the proposed rules, we know where they're coming from now, but when we see them in writing, it'll give everyone an opportunity to dig in and digest and certainly have comments. And I know you've put a lot of work and energy in this, the whole department, and you have an initiative going, but I hope that you guys do listen to the comments if they're valid and are willing to make changes after all the work you've put in to do a proposed rule. Sometimes it seems like there's just a quick explanation to explain it off, but I hope in these instances that with this set of rules that everyone listens and the open dialogue continues, and there is room for change if someone comes up with some good suggestions or has questions of how this could impact more people than it's going to help. So that's all I ask.
That is 100% reasonable, and is something that I agree with. I've been there for, this is my 33rd year doing flood protection, and the last thing that I want to be my legacy as I go off into the sunset one day is to have a rule that was not done with the proper information or was ill-conceived, right? So I lose sleep over every aspect of this. So we definitely take it very, very, very seriously. I want my kids and my grandkids to inherit, a safe and, successful state. So we read every single comment that comes in, and we respond to them. So.
All right, we'll appreciate that ahead of time, Vince, because that'll be good. Again, thank you again. I think everyone got a lot out of this today. We had a pretty good group here. Vicki, our environmental committee is always out to help our constituents and bring these efforts to the forefront. And Vince, you did a great job today, and I hope we help some people. Now they're aware of what's coming, and we'll have more dialogue, and be fair for everybody. So that's all I have to say. Thanks again, Vince.
Well, thank you. It's my honor.
Everyone have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Vince. Thanks, everybody.